Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Monday, November 20th, 2017. A short week with the Thanksgiving holiday approaching. We'll be here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then take a few days off. On Friday, the Trump administration forwarded to the Congress a request for an additional $44 billion in disaster relief. And the money will go to Florida and Texas, big Republican states that delivered for Trump, and some to Puerto Rico. While Puerto Rico is going to get shortchanged again, they're not going to get bupkis. But that's what has been earmarked for California wildfire victims. Bupkis. Absolutely nothing. And North Bay Congressman Mike Thompson, Jared Huffman, they're steaming mad. Governor Jerry Brown timely forwarded a $7.4 billion disaster relief request to the White House. It's very routine. But California is not just getting stiffed here. I imagine eventually they'll work out something and we'll get some kind of chump change to help the people whose lives have been destroyed by this massive, out-of-control wildfire that began on October 8th. But the other insult is the tax bill, the tax cut for the rich and corporations that has special treatment for California and a handful of other states, including New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. And the common thread is that these are states that largely went for the Democrat last year and are considered solid blue states. And the cap of mortgage interest deduction, the increase in the standard deduction, the loss of the write-off of state and local taxes. It's hard for us not to feel that these are specially designed to make us pay more. California is already a net donor to Washington. Despite all the aerospace money and other money that comes back to California, we pay more in taxes than we get in bennies. And finally, there's an article published that fully reflects my view. And you may have heard me talk about this from time to time over the last few months as we have talked about the Republican plans to cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations. And that is, my question is, has anybody bothered to make the case that we need a tax cut? And over at Forbes magazine, which is hardly the world's socialist website or the Communist Party Daily, Stan Collender wrote an op-ed, and Forbes says, well, this is his opinion, not ours. It's headlined, GOP tax bill is the end of all economic sanity in Washington. And Stan Collender goes through point by point. There's no economic justification whatsoever for a tax cut at this time. GDP is growing. Unemployment is below what's commonly considered full employment. Corporate profits, record levels. The stock markets are soaring. He says it makes no sense to add any federal government-induced stimulus to all this private sector-caused economic activity, let alone a tax cut as big as this one, and I will add, funded by borrowing. And he says that this guns and butter economic policy will increase the federal deficit by $2 trillion or more and likely trigger inflation and much higher interest rates than would otherwise occur. He goes on to say the GOP tax bill may be enacted without anyone who votes for it having any understanding of the damage it could do to the economy. They have wishes, hopes, and prayers, but in reality, nothing beyond the economic equivalent of pagan superstition. And that is really a great description. Republicans who, when there's a Democrat in the White House or Democrats controlling Congress, they're laser focused on the debt. Got to reduce the debt. It's killing us. $20 trillion, killing us. But they'll write blank checks to the Pentagon and they will cut taxes, regardless of the impact, whenever they can. It's reflexive. It's obsessive. It's in their political DNA. And Collender goes on to say there's no reason to rush this debate like the Republicans are doing, given that it's not really needed. A bill that's enacted in January or February will make as much economic sense as one signed by the end of December, which is to say, not that much. Then he's got some bullet points. The $1 trillion a year budget deficit will not be the result of cyclical changes that will be reversed when the economy improves. These will be permanent structural deficits. The tax hikes that will be needed to resolve the structural imbalance between federal spending and revenues will be impossible for political reasons. And, kind of like becoming resistant to antibiotics, if there is another crash like 2008, there will be little room for the government to borrow to stimulate the economy to try to put it back on track. And he points out without massive cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and at the Pentagon, it won't be possible to reduce federal spending enough to do more than tweak the deficit. And he concludes by saying that the Republican plan is almost a textbook definition of economic insanity. Amen, Stan Collender. I've linked to his column. It's in the show file for today's podcast. You can read it, and you can weep right on your screen. Meanwhile, we have a number of Republican senators who are raising objections to the current composition of the Senate tax cut for the rich and corporations bill. And what remains to be seen is if they're just posers. Are they just posturing? Now, Susan Collins of Maine objects to the last-minute decision to insert the end of the Obamacare personal mandate, which theoretically frees up $300 billion to pay for these tax cuts, but at the expense of health care and the revenue that comes from people who actually pay the tax under the individual mandate instead of buying insurance. We've got Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who says that he is dedicated to pass-through entities. These are LLCs, limited liability companies, and partnerships, where the entity doesn't pay taxes. The person who owns it, or the people who own it, pay taxes on the final income amount. Now, I've participated in this form of business, and it has advantages. But will Ron Johnson refuse to vote for the package if they don't acquiesce to his requirements? And what about Bob Corker, the guy who's already bailed? He's not running for re-election next year. So they don't have much hold over him, and he claims to be a deficit hawk. Will he spread his wings? As a true hawk should? And we also have Senator Collins kind of hedging, saying, well, she could vote for the tax cuts if the Patty Murray-Lamar Alexander bill to extend federal subsidies for 2 years is passed, and with another one that she's offered with Senator Bill Nelson of Florida is passed to bring down premium costs. There's Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who has been showered with goodies in this bill. And she's hemming and hawing a little bit, but after she hawed, she said, but don't construe this to say that I'm going to vote against it. Now, when it comes to this personal mandate, there's an interesting piece in the New York Times today. And essentially, the Republicans argue that everyone who faces the personal mandate because they don't want to buy health insurance, they are being denied the liberty to live and die without health insurance. When we know the real issue is whether they can afford it and whether they think they will use it, so they make a cost-benefit analysis. And some people who are in their 20s figure, I'm not going to get sick. Why should I pay hefty rates for health insurance coverage? But when you scratch beneath the surface, about 60% of people who buy their own insurance plan to keep being insured, whether there is a mandate or not. The critical issue is the subsidies that make the coverage affordable. And so by talking about personal liberty, it reminds me of the most extreme remarks of Ron Paul, when he was running for president. And he was asked, well, should we just let people choose not to have coverage and then they either die or go to the emergency room where it costs us more? And he's that kind of an extreme libertarian. He basically said yes. So it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. But one of the other little nuggets that's buried in the tax cut bill, and I believe this is the Senate bill, is that the impact of doubling the standard deduction, that's actually in both the House and Senate versions, just to be correct, by doubling the standard deduction, they remove the incentive for 31 million families to make some charitable contributions that are deductible. And one analysis indicates that it could cost nonprofits as much as $13 billion a year. 10% of the workforce is employed by nonprofits. And this would be a heavy hit. But, of course, the wealthy people who are writing the bills for other wealthy people, they don't worry about that. They don't need a deduction to write a check. And so it goes. Over the weekend, Josh Barro published a very strong piece looking back at the last 25 years of the Democratic Party and the damage done by Bill and Hillary Clinton. His headline reads, "The Clintons held the Democratic Party hostage for 2 decades, and the sudden revisionism is inconveniently late." Now, it's been almost 3 decades, to be fair. 2.5, all right. But Barro is really, I think, very harsh and extremely accurate about at least some aspects of the Clinton phenomena. And this has come to light because Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York who holds the seat that Hillary Clinton had for a while, will note that it does not belong to her or Dan Moynihan or anybody else who held it before. Gillibrand was asked last week, and she said, yeah, I think under today's climate, Bill Clinton should have resigned in 1998 after his affair with Monica Lewinsky was revealed. And so this has led to some kind of revisionist look back at the history. And that's what Barro goes into here. He quotes Matt Iglesias. Once Hillary Clinton threw her hat into the ring after the attempted impeachment of Bill, she immediately became America's presumptive first woman president, creating a kind of reputational vortex that shielded her husband's behavior from scrutiny. And Barro notes that one reason that their reputations weren't separable for Democrats was the key role Hillary had played over the years seeking to discredit Bill's accusers. If you admitted that his sexual behavior consisted of more than just a consensual blowjob, as Hillary's longtime press aide Philippe Reines recently said, then you would have to admit she had been wrong, and not feminist to defend him through it all. But it isn't just the sex stuff, says Barro. Over the years, the Clintons built a financial apparatus together that got more and more uncomfortable for a party of the left to defend. That's the foundation. That's her high-dollar speeches to Wall Street and other corporate clients. And the founding of the Teneo Group, which Doug Brand ran parallel to the Clinton Foundation, and which provided the big speaking fees, these hefty paydays for Bill Clinton, while he was so unselfishly doing so well for the third world with the Clinton Foundation. But Barro says, yeah, well, this is an example of a case where extremely wealthy people in countries with questionable human rights records come together and give their money away to further their agendas and burnish their reputations. And he notes one of my pet peeves, that during her last months at the State Department, Hillary Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin, was on the payroll of State, the Clinton Foundation, and Teneo, all at the same time. So I've linked to this article, and I encourage you to read it because I think it is an honest review and rebuke of Clintonism. And it contrasts sharply with the party that was held in Little Rock over the weekend to celebrate the 25 years since Bill was elected to the White House. And they got that hard-hitting interrogator, James Carville, to moderate a presentation with Bill and Hill. And they got in their digs at Donald Trump. At one point, Bill said, "I'm proud of her for getting caught trying to put people first," referring to her defeat by the Trumper. And they basically dodged all the serious issues, and they got off some, nasty lines about Trump and weaponizing information. The article doesn't explicitly state that Russia was blamed, but I have to imagine it was. And that same Philippe Reines that I mentioned a moment ago tweeted at Kirsten Gillibrand last week that she was a hypocrite because she had taken endorsements, money, and the Clintons' Senate seat from New York State. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. People who kick in $5, $10, sometimes $20 a month. Rosita Walker just took out a new annual subscription. Thank you very much, Rosita. I really appreciate that. Stuart Russell, Brian Wilcuts, and Mark Brodsky, they're all recurring contributors to this podcast, $5 or $10 a month. And I invite you to join them. We've had a couple of new sign-ups lately. I really appreciate that. Can I tilt you over the edge here at the Thanksgiving, Black Friday holiday season? Can you earmark a few bucks for the Peter B. Collins podcast? I hope you will. Just visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and boom, you can make a decision and kick in just a couple of minutes. And if you're allergic to PayPal, and some people are, and I understand why, you can communicate with me, including sending checks, cash, or money order to Peter B. Collins or Collins Media Services at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. That's Box 150, 660, 150-660, San Rafael, 94915. Well, this is becoming an expandable feature here, but here are the latest subjects of accusation of improper sexual behavior. Glenn Thrush, who was hired by the New York Times from Politico and has been on the White House beat this year and has made some news. He's been suspended, and while he's on suspension, he is going to enter a substance abuse program. This follows a report by Vox based on the account of Laura McGann, who used to work at Politico with Thrush, and she has collected the stories of women in their 20s who went drinking with 50-year-old Glenn Rush, and then he made moves on them, moves that they found unwelcome, uninvited, and those moves were rebuffed. Now, he's considered a hypocrite because after Mark Halperin, the ABC, and he's an author of books, and he did that feature last year on the campaign trail for HBO. After he was accused of abusing his position back at ABC News a few years ago, Glenn Rush had put out a tweet saying, "Young people who come into a newsroom deserve to be taught our trade, given our support, and enlisted in our calling, not betrayed by little men who believe they are bigger than the mission." But apparently he's one of those little men, and there are several instances of where he used his age, his influence, and his stature to mentor young women and then try to get his hands on them. Al Franken reportedly put his hands, uninvited, on a woman's butt as she was posing for a photo with him at the Minnesota State Fair in 2010. Her husband took the picture. And many women I've heard from who've seen this picture assumed that if Franken groped her, it had to be after the camera was snapped, because you can't see any indication of where Franken's hand is or that he has groped her at that point. And unfortunately, this is kind of reminiscent of what Poppy Bush is accused of. President 41. Going back to 1992 and even more recently from his wheelchair, the elder Bush has apparently squeezed women's butts and made a joke about David Copperfield on more than one occasion. And so this has led to further calls for Al Franken to resign or be expelled from the Senate. And I have to say, it brings up conflicting feelings. I told you last week, I've had a few minor encounters with Al Franken. I don't particularly like him. He's been an okay senator, but not a real progressive. If he resigns, the Democratic governor of Minnesota would appoint another Democrat to fill out his seat, so it's not the risk of turning it over to a Republican, at least not right away. But those political calculations are secondary to me. We've got to have some standard. We must have some evidence before these allegations can be used to destroy a person's career, whether you're in the movies or an elected official. And I'll point out, not that I'm defending Roy Moore, but the initial case is of attempted sexual assault on a 14-year-old girl. Most of the rest of them are for creepy behavior at the Gadsden, Alabama Mall. They are not the same. But we're seeing that politically people are very selective about this. The Bible thumpers who defend Roy Moore and believe that this is a late hit in a political campaign can easily just deny what's been reported. And people who like Al Franken, who are hardline Democrats, who think this is unfair, who think that Leanne Tweeden was politically motivated to make her accusation last week, there's a lot of rationalization going on. And as you know, I do not support zero tolerance. I think we have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but there has to be a standard that we measure these things against. Now we've got Jeffrey Tambor, the star of the Transparent series about a guy who is a transsexual late in life. He denies the allegations brought by a former assistant and by an actress who appeared on Transparent with him. But nevertheless, he is going to step down from this Netflix series. And did I mention? I didn't yet. Russell Simmons, the co-founder of Def Jam Records, facing allegations from women dating back 25 years to 1991 and 1992 that he not only was guilty of sexual assault, but he shared these young women with a colleague named Brett Ratner. And again, I can't evaluate these he said, she said stories. Because Russell Simmons is black, because he was running a hip-hop label, I think it's very easy for people to just say, oh, yeah, that's probably true. But again, we have no standard, no process, no constitutional protections for people who are being accused in this wave of zero tolerance. And I must add that I respect the women who have come forward. Some of them take significant risk to do so. But when we see pile-ons, like this State Fair photo of Al Franken, like Melanie Morgan, the Bay Area right-wing radio host who claims that Al Franken harassed her because he was having an argument with her, again, this is a slippery slope, and I fear that we are going to descend into an ugly pit at some point. Now, here's a real case. Former Oklahoma State Senator Ralph Shorty has reached a plea deal with federal prosecutors after it was exposed that he tried to take a 17-year-old boy to a Motel 6, and he had condoms with him. And there are Craigslist ads, there are Kik These are supposed to be encrypted communications, but apparently with a warrant you can get them. And the sex trafficking charge that he's agreeing to is a trade for prosecutors dropping 3 child pornography charges in the plea deal. So he faces about 10 years in prison under the sex trafficking charge. We'll see about his sentencing in the near future. And a lot's been made about Roy Moore. I'm not aware of any new accusers who've come forward over the weekend. But we helped explain about his opponent, Doug Jones, who does have some accomplishments as a former prosecutor, who dug up the cold case and convicted 2 Klan members for the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. But Doug Jones is a guy who has been co-opted by the Riley machine in Alabama. He was one of Don Siegelman's lawyer, and our friend and associate Roger Schuler reports that he did a lousy job. And it's interesting to me because the New York Times profiles Roy Moore's opponent, Doug Jones, and how the National Democrats are sending money, but that's about it. There is no major state party organization in Alabama, and they say that there are no elder statesmen of the Democratic Party who could come and help campaign with Doug Jones. They've completely written out Don Siegelman, who was the most successful Democrat since George Wallace in Alabama statewide politics, and who was railroaded into federal prison by Karl Rove and colleagues. But the New York Times doesn't acknowledge that. Trump has once again put North Korea on a list of state sponsors of terrorism. George W. Bush had removed them as a negotiating tactic, and Trump is putting them back on that list. Meanwhile, General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, has been quoted, but he denies, and the source denies, that at a dinner in July with the CEO of Oracle, the software company, her name is Safra Catz, McMaster bluntly trashed his boss. He was labeled an idiot, a dope, a kindergartner, and in another encounter with other people, McMaster is quoted as saying that Crown Prince Jared Kushner has no business being in the White House and should not be involved in national security issues. And McMaster also trashed Mattis, Rexon Tillerson, Steve Bannon when he was there. It's juicy, but we don't really know if this is true. Well, there's a situation off the coast of Argentina that brings to mind a great song, my favorite one, from Thomas Dolby. One of our submarines is missing tonight, and Argentina's Navy thought they heard some pings from the submerged submarine over the weekend. Now they're saying we do not have clear evidence that the calls came from that unit. The submarine left the extreme southern port of Ushuaia on Wednesday and lost contact as it was heading to Mar del Plata. And that's about as much as we know right now. Speaking of the military, all 54,000 U.S. soldiers in Japan have been ordered to stay away from booze for an indefinite period because a 21-year-old Marine crashed his 2-ton military truck into another vehicle while he was drunk, killing the driver, who was a Japanese citizen. I wish I could say this is the first time that has ever happened. In Nebraska, regulators have approved an alternative route, but they've also approved the installation of the Keystone XL pipeline across Nebraska's territory. The Republicans who dominate a state public utilities commission voted 3-2 to approve the alternate route and the construction, despite the spill in neighboring South Dakota last week of over 200,000 gallons of the ugly tar sands goo that flows through those pipelines. Here's a little good news. Democrats in the House of Representatives are reestablishing the antitrust caucus. With Bayer's merger to Monsanto pegged at $66 billion, AT&T and Time Warner, $85 billion merger, CVS and the health insurer Aetna, a $66 billion deal. I applaud this effort, and I want to give a shout-out to Ro Khanna. He is a freshman Democrat from Silicon Valley, a guy who I was queasy about because he took out a longtime Democrat Mike Honda in the election last year. But Ro Khanna has proved to be an advocate for peace, a guy who believes in the war powers that Congress is supposed to have, and now he wants to fight these big mergers. He said, I believe the concentration of economic power is one of the big causes of declining wages, of the lack of new small business formation, and lack of economic empowerment for many small towns. Good for you, Ro. And finally today, there's a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of people who are expressing deep venom and anger at the murderous cult leader Charles Manson, who died in a Southern California hospital over the weekend at the age of 83. And I'll just add a few comments. Number one, I'm embarrassed that Charles Manson, like me, was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I learned in reading some alternative outlets that Charles Manson, while he was in jail in the 1950s, before he got the idea for the cult and recruited his followers, he was heavily influenced by Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People and by L. Ron Hubbard's book, Dianetics. And while I have no love for the Church of Scientology, I will acknowledge that Manson was never a member of the church. But he spent more hours being audited under Dianetics while he was in federal prison in the late 50s than many people who achieve clear status by paying for Scientology's bizarre method of analyzing people. And the other thing I'll note is that when I was first breaking into radio in Chicago, my first full-time job was at WGLD, and the station manager was a greasy little chain-smoking Camel cigarette guy named Charles E. Manson. And he didn't want you to call him Chuck or Charlie. He seemed really proud to share his name with an infamous killer. Thanks for listening to my news and comment podcast today. Like always, it's free, and you can find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.